An armored car filled to the brim with cash. A classic example of a brilliant inside job. The perfect heist. But there's no honor among thieves.
It feels like a kick right in the stomach. It just jumped out. Wow, both of us looked at it and went, uh-oh.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
On the job application for some armored car companies, prospective employees are asked, "Have you ever thought about robbing an armored car?" If they answer no, they don't get the job. Everyone has had a dream about pulling off the perfect heist. Meet the 3 Ps. Angelo Portante, an armored car company employee for 8 years. Piero Perciabali, a veteran officer with the Toronto Police Force. And Andre Pelliconi, a part-time chef and former bouncer. Angelo Portante and Piero Perciabali were ideal as the 2 masterminds. Angelo knew the inside workings of the armored car company, and Piero knew the inside procedure of the cops. Armored car security today is so tight that most thieves wouldn't waste their time trying to rob one. But no matter what protection these armored car companies install, there is a factor they can't control: the human factor. Angelo had a hunch that one of his fellow employees, an armored car guard who is also an auxiliary cop, would likely depart from procedure to help a fellow cop in trouble. Angelo's old friend Andre was going to play that cop. Are you starting to get the idea? On the morning of the heist, Angelo Portante calls Officer Piero Perciabali, saying everything is set for that night. Angelo then contacts 2 other accomplices, both truck drivers, to stand by for further instructions. Piero will control the whole operation from a distance. He knows that if it's going to work, everything would have to go off like clockwork. The conspirators meet before going into action. Meanwhile, Angelo, the inside man, has cleverly placed himself far from the scene of the crime, in a completely different part of town. A perfect alibi. It's the last weekend of the summer, the Labor Day weekend, and the targeted armored car is stuffed full of cash. To distract police, Piero gets the 2 truck driver accomplices to place phony 911 calls, saying that there is a brawl in progress and that a cop is in trouble. It works. Every police car in the district rushes in the opposite direction. When the armored car arrives at its scheduled stop, Andre, the fake cop, goes into action. Andre drives the armored car to a parking lot. The money is unloaded into a waiting van. The van is then driven to a meeting place where Piero steps in and takes over. He drives off in the van alone. At the end of Angelo's shift, he meets up with Piero. They're like two kids in a candy store. They've actually pulled it off. The armored car had been carrying over $3 million in cash. Gone. Minutes after the heist, police are called and arrive on the scene. Shortly after that, the armored car is found half a mile away, empty. Investigators immediately question the driver, since he is the only one who saw what happened. He says, "There was a cop who seemed to be in some kind of trouble and needed help. But when I opened my door, he pulled a gun on me and drove off with the truck." The armored car crew are all taken back to police headquarters to be questioned. All the police know is $3 million is missing. The investigators assigned to the case are Doug Kwan and Rod Redquist.
In an investigation like this, the first thing you want to do is clear the people who are working on the truck, because they are the most likely suspects right off the bat.
Investigators interview all three of the armored car crew. But to the police, the driver is the most suspicious.
He was very calm, cool, and Doug and I both found that very unusual given that set of circumstances. He certainly was a strong suspect because of the fact that on that evening he wasn't supposed to drive. He asked the other fella who was the guard if he would mind letting him drive for the evening.
Not only this, the driver opened his door, breaking a cardinal rule, and admitted not wearing his gun, an equally serious breach of company rules. This was starting to feel a lot like an inside job. The ident squad goes over the armored car with a fine-tooth comb.
You go in the truck, you don't know what is evidence. Anything could be evidence in that thing. So you have to consider it all. You have to look at it all. You have to collect a lot of items. And you take a lot of items, and a lot of them are useless at the end of it all. But you don't know that right away.
Ed meticulously collects hairs and fibers from the scene. Then he zeroes in on something.
When I see paper scattered on the ground, I think, oh good, there could be footprints on these papers. I may be able to collect them. So the way I do it, and in this particular case, I've got a kit that I carry with me.
He places a sheet of mylar over the paper and zaps it with his electrostatic charger.
And that gives it a static charge, and the mylar goes down into the paper, and the paper gets sucked up into the mylar, and the dust attaches to the mylar. So when you peel the mylar off the paper, you get the dust impression going with the mylar. You flip her over and you get the oblique lighting, you look at it, and if you see the footprint, all right. It gives you a chill when you see that footprint. You go, oh, I gotcha.
As exciting as it may be for the ident officer, he still needs a suspect's shoe to make a match. Police also suspect that the bogus 911 calls are connected to the heist. They were recorded on tape, but for the recordings to be useful as evidence, police need suspects and voices for comparison.
They said they were police officers. They told me to call 911. Okay, where?
Investigators were stumped. They had an armored car driver they suspected, a shoe print that wasn't leading to the bad guys, and 2 phony 911 calls. It looked like the 3 Ps were going to get away with it. The pressure is on. The case makes headlines every day for a week, and the police still don't have a serious lead. A week after the heist, Angelo and Piero are sitting on the cash. But Angelo is starting to get cocky, flashing money around and talking just a bit too much. A $50,000 reward is offered for information leading to the arrest of the robbers. A man calls in with a tip. He suggests they check out someone the cops had more or less ruled out. Angelo Portante. They start to dig into Angelo's background. They learn that in addition to working as a guard for the company, Angelo also has his own private security agency on the side.
Well, sure, we got information that he was a friendly type of guy, a likable guy. He was open, pretty courteous and cordial with everybody. He was a former auxiliary police officer.
To investigators, Portante seems a long shot as a suspect. And besides, they know he was working far away from the scene at the time of the heist. They go back to the informant for more details.
He described the bundles of money, which we did not make public. They had certain wrappers on them and
Identifiable markings on them.
Only the person that had done the robbery or had spoken to someone would have knowledge of it.
It is enough for police to set up a sting. They want to surprise Angelo away from his home, so he can't alert anyone or make a phone call and possibly move the money.
We called them up and had a conversation with them, told them that we were in our own business and we wanted to arrange a contract where he'd be moving some product for us. And he was pretty excited that he may have a client here, and he agreed to meet us. And when we got there, he expected to meet a couple businessmen.
Angelo is caught off guard. He's got $14,000 on him.
He just kind of went pale, and I think he knew the gig was up.
Police obtain a search warrant for Angelo's office and for his home. There they find some valuables that he couldn't possibly have afforded on his salary.
We found approximately $170,000 worth of diamonds in a safe with an illegal weapon. And it just started to look worse and worse for him at that point.
In Angelo's office, police find detailed cell phone bills. His telephone call display is especially intriguing. It lists the phone numbers of people Angelo called on the day of the robbery. It's a real windfall for the investigators.
The fact that he had these phone numbers still on his call display from the day of the robbery and the day before, I never expected to find that.
So police begin checking Angelo's call list. Many of the numbers are traced to cellular phones. Every time you make a call on a cell phone, the date, time, and location are registered digitally, and this information is stored in a central databank. This technology has led to a whole new branch of forensics, tracking the source of cell phone calls used in crimes. Warren Leonard is a Bell Mobility fraud and security expert. He works with law enforcement on criminal matters involving cell phones.
We deal with the police when they come in for informational requests. We satisfy search warrants, subpoenas. We do the court testimony on call records if required.
Leonard provides the police with the names of the individuals whose cell phone numbers appear on Angelo's call display. 2 of the numbers are traced to the truck drivers. At least 20 calls had gone back and forth between these truck drivers and Angelo on the day of the robbery. But there are still several names which they get from Angelo's call display that investigators can't account for. One of them is none other than Perciabali. They have no idea who he is, but 2 weeks after the robbery, while going through their own internal police directory, they get a lucky break.
While looking through the nominal roll, totally nothing to do with this case, looking for an officer's name who started with a P that we were going to send a notification to go to court for. There was Perciabali's name, and it just jumped out. And, wow. So we said, look at Perciabali. Both of us looked at it and went, uh-oh. It feels like you've had a kick right in the stomach, to be crude about it. To think that a police officer, one of our own brothers, would be involved in a serious offense like this with the potential of so much violence and greed.
But the driver's account described a very different-looking cop at the heist. Police are determined to find out Perciabali's connection to the crime. In order to set him up, police decide to do something rarely done before. They place a wire in Piero's car. They bug a police car. Police hope that Piero will lead them to the others involved in the robbery, and quite possibly to the missing millions. While Angelo sits in jail, detectives continue to investigate his cell phone activity around the time of the heist. Angelo might not have been anywhere near the scene of the crime, but his cell phone activities may turn his alibis into Swiss cheese.
He is the custodian on that route, so he is by himself in the back of the truck. And it's a reinforced steel truck, so you can have your own private conversations in the back of that truck.
Angelo's calls that night were not quite as private as he had hoped. His cell phone was also doing some talking to the database on the cellular network.
We create a call record for every call that's made on the network. These individual call records have a variety of information stored in them, such as your mobile number, so we know who to build a call to, the numbers that were dialed, the duration of the call, and the location where your call was made or received in terms of our towers. This is an example of a tower map. Here we have the red dot indicating the location of the tower. The outside area shows the diameter of the coverage area for the tower, and then you can see the individual pieces of the pie we call sectors.
Calls can be traced to exact sectors, which can be as small an area as a few city blocks. Using this data, can detectives place these individuals at a certain place at a certain time? And can they relate this information to the execution of the perfect heist? 2 months after the heist, police haven't found the money and Angelo is keeping quiet. They lack hard evidence to make further arrests, so they focus in on Percivali in hopes that he'll unwittingly provide a breakthrough. Through the wiretaps on Percivali's car, they overhear him alerting one of the truck drivers that the heat is on. Police nab the truck driver and bring him in for questioning. They suspect that he may have been one of the 911 callers. They ask him to read the identical phrases recorded on the 911 call. The recordings are taken to Steve Pausak at the Center for Forensic Sciences.
Okay, I want Dixon and Mark Stroll.
Pausak compares the 911 voices with the truck drivers through what's called a sound spectrograph.
There's a big brawl behind the Kelseys. There's like 50, 40. There's a big brawl behind the.
There's a big brawl behind.
There's a big brawl behind the Kelseys.
There's a big brawl behind the Kelseys.
He wants to determine whether the acoustical features of both voices are the same.
There's a big brawl behind the Kelseys. There's like 50, 40.
There's a big brawl behind the Kelseys. Like 50, 40 people.
Pausak concludes that the truck driver's voice is a probable match, but probable isn't enough for investigators. When pressed further, the truck driver finally spills the beans about the heist. Investigators now have a good idea of how the crime worked, but they still need to pinpoint the exact whereabouts of the suspects on the night of the robbery in order to make a convincing court case. The hard evidence they need requires many days of painstaking work. Poring over data, maps, cell phone records. Finally, the precise connections are made, and they are able to construct a plausible picture of exactly what happened and when, to the second. 10:48 a.m. on the day of the heist, Angelo calls Piero saying everything is on schedule for that night. 12:33 p.m., Angelo calls one of the truck drivers. It's the first of more than 50 calls back and forth between Angelo, Piero, and the two truck drivers that day. 4 p.m., the crew is observed leaving to do their rounds. 10 p.m., the conspirators meet before going into action. 11:02, they leave the meeting spot. 11:45, Piero, following the armored vehicle, has the truck drivers make the diversionary calls. $11:50, Piero watches the armored car approach the bank. 11:52, the heist itself. It takes less than a minute to pull it off. 12:14 a.m., Angelo was called in the back of his armored car and informed that everything has gone off as planned. After 2 months and thousands of man-hours, detectives can at last move in and make their arrests. But there doesn't turn out to be much honor among thieves. The truck drivers decide to become witnesses for the prosecution against the Big Three: Angelo Portante, Piero Perciabali, and Andre Pelliconi. The cell phones told the story, and forensics could back that story up. But during the court case, they hit a major stumbling block. The three Ps all refuse to acknowledge that they even know one another. The whole case could fall apart unless the prosecution can link them. That's when investigators remember a piece of evidence they had not paid much attention to earlier. After they arrested Piero Perciabali, they found a small yellow sticky note in his briefcase. Written on it was the fake cop Andre Pelliconi's name. From looking at Angelo's daytimer, police believed it was in Angelo's handwriting. If they can prove it, a clear, unbroken chain can be established connecting the two masterminds to each other and to the fake cop.
Fortunately, in this instance, I had a ton of printing. The day planner was just filled with hand printing and numerals all through it, so I had lots of material for comparison. His A is formed the same as all his other A's, goes up to the top, down to the bottom on the right-hand side, cuts diagonally across to the left, and continues out the crossbar, forms a connector to the following letter again. It was fortunate that Mr. Portante is such a distinctive printer or handwriter. All the forms came out beautifully for comparison. The similarities just jumped off the page. I ended up in a situation where I was sure that this was the same writer, and I didn't have any doubts whatsoever.
That was the clincher. Angelo Portante got 10 years. Piero Perciabali also got 10 years. And Andre Pelliconi, 6 years. The two truck drivers got off in exchange for their testimony. But what happened to the money? Angelo's brother Tony claimed he gave 3 gun cases filled with cash to a friend, who in turn claimed he gave them to his girlfriend, but they were never found. To date, they've accounted for over $1 million. That leaves over $2 million still missing. Maybe it will turn out to be the perfect heist after all. Severed body parts scattered across a field. Who was the victim? Investigators and scientists must reconstruct this human being piece by piece. But without a positive ID of the body, someone's going to get away with murder. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. The head is the single most important part of the human body. It controls everything. It is also our identity. Who are we without it? Exhibit A, 17 severed pieces of a human body. March 1987. A game warden north of Montreal finds what appears to be pieces of a human corpse scattered in the woods. Homicide is called in, and one of the first on the scene is Detective Jacques Landry.
There was not only one piece, but a lot of pieces, all spread out in an area about, I would say, 500 feet away.
Ident officers gather the body parts from around the immediate vicinity. Some of the parts have remnants of fabric still frozen to them. Detective Landry comes upon a trunk nearby. It's empty. But barely visible inside the luggage tag, they find a crumpled up piece of paper. The tag is sent to the documents section of the Quebec Forensic Science Center for further tests. The body parts are all collected and sent to the morgue to be autopsied. Usually, the pathologist gets a whole body to work on. Not this time.
We received 17 bags with 17 body parts as they had been found on the ground. Unfortunately, the one piece we didn't have was the head.
Not only does Lausanne have to find out how this man died, but also who he was.
The role of the pathologist is to make bodies talk. They don't speak English. They don't speak French. They speak a language that gives us many indicators we can use to begin determining what happened to a person just before or even after death.
For the pathologist, these body parts are speaking, but just a little. Having no head complicates his autopsy. Lausanne is unable to determine the cause of death. What he can say by observing the clean cuts to the body parts is that the victim was dead and frozen when his body was cut up by a saw of some kind. But the most daunting challenge Lausanne faces is to determine who the man is.
L'ensemble du corps nous suggérait une personne.
To me, the body suggested someone who came from the Mediterranean area because of the color and pigmentation of the skin. On the upper right chest, we found a birthmark. On the back were white spots. These could have been discoloration caused by the fact that this person had been dead a certain amount of time, or it could have been the result of an illness, which is called vitiligo, which results in a loss of pigmentation in the skin.
Dr. Lausanne will need several points of comparison to be able to prove who it is in a court of law. Meanwhile, from the documents section, investigators get what they hope is a lead from the scrap of paper in the luggage tag. There is a name on the paper. It appears to read Alejandro Bainstein. They search civic records in Montreal to obtain current addresses for Mr. Bainstein's home and business. Detective Landry goes to the home address, proceeding with great caution. As he has no idea yet who the dead man is, he doesn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. He wants to watch and assess before making any moves. From neighbors, he learns that Alejandro Bainstein is a successful businessman, that his wife's name is Carol, and that the couple have 2 young children. He notices there's no sign of Mr. Bainstein. Landry begins watching Bainstein's computer business. He sees Carol Bainstein come and go, sometimes with their kids, but most often alone. She appears to be running the store. Again, her husband is not around. From discreet inquiries, Landry learns that Bainstein is thought to be in Vancouver to start a franchise of his successful business. Surveillance of a retail business isn't easy with so many people passing through, so Landry searches for patterns that may help determine his next step. It's an unusual approach, but Landry wants to find out as much as he can before speaking to those close to Alejandro Bainstein. He notices a couple of people during the first week of his surveillance who seem to be regular visitors. The first is a neighbor of the Bainsteins, Philippe Laberge. The other meets with Mrs. Bainstein on several occasions. Investigators find out he's a pal of Laberge, whose name is Robert Craig. Investigators turn up a third interesting individual, nicknamed Mikey. He's known to be Alejandro Bainstein's best friend. A week into his surveillance, and so far Landry has precious little to go on. He has a headless body which has been sawn into 17 pieces, a name on a crumpled piece of paper, a missing man, Alejandro Bainstein, and 4 people who may know where he is now. Landry needs to make his move to get closer to the source. But who should he turn to first? Detective Landry has a hunch that Mikey may be his best source of information about Alejandro Bainstein. Cautious at first, Mikey tells Landry that Alejandro is a loyal friend, a devoted family man who adores his 2 kids. He's well liked in the small Spanish-Jewish community of Montreal. Landry learns that lately Alejandro has been heartbroken because his wife has been having an affair with their neighbor, Philippe Laberge. It's the kind of lead that Landry is looking for. According to Mikey, the affair took its toll on Alejandro. Even though he still worked at the store, Alejandro moved out of the house and got his own apartment. Mikey tells Landry that 2 weeks ago, he went to visit his friend at the store. He was surprised when Carol told him that her husband had gone to Vancouver to set up a new business. Just days earlier, Mikey had lunch with Alejandro, and he never mentioned a trip to Vancouver. It's just not like Alejandro to leave town without saying something. Landry's starting to smell a rat. On Landry's request, Mikey supplies photos of Alejandro. Can these pictures help the pathologist connect the 17 body parts found in the field with Alejandro Bainstein? Luckily, in some of the pictures, Alejandro is wearing a bathing suit.
We did identify a birthmark in the same place, on the upper right chest.
But it's not enough to convince a court of law. This could still be just coincidental.
In such a major crime as an homicide, if you cannot even start with the identification of the victim, you got nothing, you cannot even start.
Like the investigators, the scientists must go the extra mile in this macabre case. There are many hospitals in Montreal, but he feels that since Alejandro is Jewish, he might at some time have gone to the city's Jewish General Hospital. If so, there could be medical records or x-rays that would provide more information about Mr. Bainstein. The hunch pays off. When the medical records are forwarded to Dr. Luzon, he is immediately able to confirm that Bainstein did in fact have the skin disease vitiligo, as the body parts suggested. Luzon is closer to being able to convince a jury of the identity of the victim. Detective Landry is closing in as well. He goes to see the superintendent at Alejandro's apartment building, armed with a search warrant. The super invites him into her apartment to talk. Little does he realize how significant a chat over a cup of tea will become. The super tells him that Carol Bainstein came to the building 2 weeks earlier, producing a telegram from San Francisco, claiming it was from her husband. It gave his wife permission to do whatever she liked with his belongings. The super says she observed Mrs. Bainstein with two men moving Alejandro's belongings. While the threesome was cleaning out the apartment, the super noticed Mrs. Bainstein washing out a bed cover in the bathtub. The water had all turned red. While Mrs. Bainstein was quick to say it must have been from the dye in the fabric, the whole incident had left the super with a strange feeling that something was wrong. Detective Landry's pulse quickens as he begins to imagine what might have happened. He's anxious to look in Alejandro's apartment. The apartment is spotless, or is it? Landry finds what appears to be several drops of blood. A blood specialist, Francois Julien, is brought into the apartment to investigate further.
The apartment was, I would say, was quite clean, with few stains here and there, and few of these stains were in fact blood. In the bedroom there was blood on the walls, in fact, at least two walls. There was blood on the floor, in the cracks. So we picked up that blood.
It is starting to point to a strong possibility of foul play. At the time of this investigation, DNA typing is not yet a science admissible in court, and scientists cannot accurately identify a person from tissue or blood samples. Julien uses ABO testing to determine whether the blood is from the same source as the body parts.
The results I had were identical to the one I had on the body parts.
These results are helpful, but still not conclusive in determining the identity of the victim. This new information from the lab gives Landry enough to go to a judge and get wiretaps on Bainstein's home and business. But then investigators are thrown a curve. In looking at Alejandro's credit card records, they discover a lot of recent transactions in Bainstein's name on the West Coast, exactly where he is supposed to be. All of a sudden, it looks like Bainstein might just be alive. Landry enlists the help of a homicide investigator in Vancouver.
I sent him pictures of the victim, the neighbor, the pal, a few pictures. I says, I would like you to go to these places and ask them if they've seen these people.
Based on information he receives from homicide in Vancouver, Landry determines that it was not Alejandro at all who had been out west, but rather LaBerge's pal, Robert Craig. Had Craig been on the West Coast signing documents in Bainstein's name? Craig is starting to look very guilty to investigators. It turns out he's got a criminal record in Europe. Detective Landry also learns more about LaBerge and believes that he also has a questionable history. Landry still needs to keep a close eye on him. From the wiretaps, Landry learns that LaBerge has been making calls to a number north of Montreal. It turns out LaBerge has a cottage up there, and the phone number is that of his neighbor. Landry knows that he has to continue following his hunches, so he takes a drive up north to talk to LaBerge's neighbor. The neighbor tells Landry that he does know LaBerge, and that in fact, LaBerge had recently borrowed a chainsaw. The man adds that he heard the chainsaw being used late into the night a few weeks ago. Once again, Landry's hunch has paid off in spades. It all starts to fit.
Well, you can imagine what kind of deduction we came out with it. It says, maybe it was not a tree, then it was cutting during the night.
Could this be a breakthrough for Landry? the tool that had torn Alejandro Bainstein into 17 pieces. More importantly, could it prove who had done it? Now that investigators and the forensic team had the chainsaw in their possession, they began running tests. But the chainsaw didn't yield its information easily.
On the blade itself, there was no fibers, there was no blood, there was nothing that could be related to the case. And I thought that maybe if I removed the protective cap, I remove all the sawdust inside, and I looked under the microscope, and what I found was fibers and fibers and fibers, and what seems to be bone chips.
Upon further testing, scientists are able to connect the fibers found inside the chainsaw to the bedsheet material found wrapped around the frozen body parts.
And the piece of what I thought was a piece of bone was submitted to the pathology, and they looked under the microscope to know if it was bone, and in fact it was bone.
The evidence is looking very damning by now, but it's still all circumstantial. As a result, they couldn't irrefutably prove who had used the chainsaw to perform this gruesome murder. No one had seen the chainsaw being used, nor were there any fingerprints on it.
You have to prove or bring the evidence without any doubt, reasonable doubt. Then there was a man at the end of the chainsaw using the chainsaw.
Without a major break and without DNA, how is Landry going to nail the murderer or murderers? Before he can act against any of the suspects, he desperately needs absolute confirmation from Dr. Lazan, the pathologist, that the body parts are in fact those of Alejandro Bainstein. Otherwise, the guilty party might get away scot-free. There's no murder without an identifiable victim. It is all up to Lazan.
We compared X-rays from the body parts with X-rays from the hospital. We had the impression that they were from the same person.
So he sends them for a radiologist's second opinion. Through a rarely used comparison of the pelvic region, the identity is confirmed.
The radiologist compared the X-rays too, and he confirmed that indeed it was the same person.
Finally, after several months of exhaustive investigation, Dr. Lazan can say without doubt that the 17 pieces are from the body of Alejandro Bainstein. Now that they have a victim, Landry can go after the suspects. LeBerge, Craig, and Carol Bainstein herself. The chainsaw evidence, the blood in the apartment, the suspicious cleanup, all point to a deadly conspiracy. In addition, it's established that the credit card signatures from out west turn out to be forgeries, and that Craig has been signing Bainstein's name. They are now able to reconstruct how the murder may have been committed. Someone came to Alejandro Bainstein's apartment, someone that he probably knew, someone that he let into the apartment because, as Landry observed, there were no signs of forced entry. Someone murdered Alejandro in his apartment, probably by shooting him in the head as he was forced onto the bed, thus soaking the bedspread in blood. They left that night or shortly thereafter, carrying Alejandro's body in a trunk. The body was probably frozen either outside or in a deep freeze, then cut up in its frozen state and dropped at the remote location. Sounds plausible, but not everyone thought so. In the trial that followed, the jury acquitted Craig of murder charges. Carol Bainstein and LeBerge were convicted of murder, but both of them appealed. The results, in the opinion of many, were shocking. Mrs. Bainstein, who during the first trial insisted that LaBerge had been a major player in the murder, for some reason now softened her story in the appeal, shifting the guilt away from LaBerge. The jury overturned LaBerge's conviction. That left Carol Bainstein. In an almost surreal turn of events, the jury felt that there was enough evidence to convict her as an accessory to murder, even though there was no convicted murderer. She was sentenced to 10 years. Alejandro Bainstein left behind his 2 young children, now being raised by relatives. His children, friends, and community loved him well, but no one could save him from his tragic end. Although the dedicated work of investigators and forensic scientists was able to give Alejandro Bainstein back his identity, the outcome was hardly satisfying. All their determination and thorough work wasn't enough to put away a cold-blooded murderer. A massive explosion destroys a quiet neighborhood. Police find racist messages in the ruins of one house. Its owners are a quiet, God-fearing couple. Who has targeted them for death? Who has scrawled the warning? We have your keys. We'll lock up. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Years ago, the Puritans of Boston believed that we lived surrounded by an invisible world of satanic demons looking for any chance to burn us with a hateful touch, their invisible hands reaching into our hearts. Exhibit A, this hate letter, written in a hand that would betray the criminal behind a monstrous deed. It's a soft May evening in the suburbs of Toronto, 1995. Without warning, a massive explosion obliterates 4 homes and damages dozens of others on a quiet street. Residents report that for 15 seconds following the blast, they cannot breathe. The explosion has sucked all the oxygen into its vortex. A column of flame leaps 100 feet into the sky, and fragments of the destroyed houses land a mile from the blast center.
It was quite a shock. I heard this enormous explosion and then followed shortly by a pressure wave that sort of knocked me off my feet. I saw that there was frame members and parts of a roof accelerating above the horizon of my street about 12 to 1,400 feet. Immediately went in and tried to phone 911, but the trunk lines were full.
In a terrifying instant, a community is torn apart. Investigators fear they'll find a massive number of dead and injured in the debris.
My God, there's going to be so many dead bodies. Look at the devastation from this huge explosion.
It was a chaotic scene. People aimlessly wandering around in a daze, not knowing what to do. The firemen were racing to put the fire out, and people were just stunned.
Two neighboring couples, the Gallants and the Gordons, are unaccounted for. The bomb squad and the fire department determined from the pattern of the blast debris that the center of the explosion is the Gordon home. And there's something even more explosive found in the rubble of their house.
As officers came looking for bodies and looking for injured people, they're virtually standing on the evidence. And when an officer looked down and saw a swastika on a panel of a garage door, he realized there's something here.
The discovery of the racist graffiti in the Gordons' home immediately brings Steve Irwin of the Hate Crimes Unit into the investigation.
We look and say, is it an organized group? Is it an Oklahoma bombing that someone is now starting in our city? Someone has got this bright idea of this is a great way to make a statement. Because the community at large is then at great risk.
Investigators work to recover evidence from the charred wreck of the Gordons' basement. They are anxious to examine anything that might provide a clue to the cause of the explosion. 7 pieces of broken pipe are sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences for examination.
Gas pipes from the house were brought to me. They're different sizes of pipes coming right from the gas meter on the outside of the house all the way over to the hot water heater and the furnace. And of those 7 sections of pipes, 2 of them had suspicious cuts. This is a close look at the cut surface of the pipe, and there's fine lines running across the cut surface indicating that it was a cut surface and not a broken surface from something like a hacksaw, the teeth leaving marks in the pipe surface as it's going through it. The hacksaw went all the way through the pipe from one side to the other, opening it up completely and allowing the gas to blow into the room.
Now police know what caused the explosion. It wasn't an accident or a bomb. It was an intentional leak of natural gas. Despite the size of the blast, it's a miracle that no one has been killed. The Gallants were out for dinner when their house was destroyed, and the Gordons were in Niagara Falls for the weekend. On their return Sunday night, the Gordons are intercepted by a police roadblock at the end of their street, still unaware that their lives have changed forever. Mr. and Mrs. Gordon are escorted to a police station where they meet lead investigator, Detective Wilson. He breaks the news about the destruction of their house and about the racist graffiti. Wilson and Constable Keeley are determined to help the Gordons in every way they can.
They were quite surprised. They couldn't believe who would do this to us. They weren't public people, public figures, they were private people. And they just couldn't believe, they were awestruck about the whole situation, and the whole subdivision is gone. After they spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon, they found them to be a couple of upright, standing citizens, a couple of hard-working individuals, a very quiet man, a church-going man.
A compassionate neighbor offers the Gordons a space, a temporary shelter from the storm, a place to begin putting their lives back together. David Gordon has his own heating and cooling business. Mrs. Gordon is a nurse at a local hospital. They are deeply religious. Who can possibly hate the Gordons enough to blow up their house? Police have no suspects in the baffling destruction of the Gordons' house, an act with the ugly stain of a hate crime. They receive their first lead when a 14-year-old high school student is caught writing a chilling message on the wall of his school washroom.
He wrote a confession that how he put a device on the pipe and he blew up this house and caused all this damage, and he's very sorry.
Detective Wilson questions the boy at great length. He's troubled and upset about his life at school. He's looking for attention, but he didn't blow up the Gordons' house. The overwhelming devastation of the Gordons' neighborhood, combined with the hate crime element, has made this a very hot story. The Gordons are swamped by the media. The police encourage Gordon to appeal for information on local TV news. The television appeal for help pays off when investigators receive a tip pointing them to a nasty piece of work named George Stryker. Stryker is a member of a motley but potentially dangerous gang of white supremacists called Aryan Fist. Police discover that Stryker also has a record of petty break-and-enters, and he loves to fight.
What you'll see from them is graffiti. You'll also see the clothing and the tattoos that identify their ideology or philosophy, the white supremacist sort of ideology or beliefs.
Stryker and his thugs fit the profile of a gang that could commit a serious hate crime. But when investigators check him out, they quickly realize that Stryker isn't smart enough to blow much more than hot air. And besides, he was in juvenile detention the night the Gordons' house was destroyed. As suspects are eliminated, Steve Irwin starts to examine the exact nature of the hate messages written inside the Gordons' garage. Something in the way one of the messages is worded catches his eye. All minority is on death list.
It's unusual that their specific backgrounds aren't brought into it, and the word minority, it's a very clean word. We often use the word politically correct. So for a hate monger or white supremacist group to use the word minority, it sort of jumps out.
The police are now beginning to wonder whether this was a hate crime at all. So who else could have done this? An unhappy customer? Or maybe even a vengeful neighbor? A canvass of the neighborhood turns up no new leads. But police begin to examine David Gordon's private life more closely. And what they find spins the investigation off in a whole new direction. Gordon is a longtime member of the Worldwide Church of God, a religious group that suffered a bitter split after the death of its founder, Herbert Armstrong. Investigators call on Jim Beverly, an expert on new religions, to help them understand how the teachings of the church might affect Gordon.
The Worldwide Church of God for a while was one of the most well-known groups in North America because they sent the plain truth free to people all over the world. And one of their leaders, Garner Ted Armstrong, was on Saturday television telling us about the world tomorrow. Ever since Herbert started his church in 1934, he was addicted to prophecy.
David Gordon had requested to be ordained a minister by the conservative branch of the church. When he was refused, Gordon became furious. Angry letters were exchanged. Could someone in the Worldwide Church of God be trying to silence David Gordon violently?
He would be taught by Mr. Armstrong that we're living near the end of the world, and he believed he had special revelation for preparing the church as it faces the battles with Satan at the end of time. He was asking the church to make radical moves to ordain him and just break the traditional pattern of ordination. And he thought that God and Jesus had made an exception in his case, and that the future of the church hinged on the leaders in California accepting his calling to ministry.
David Gordon's life is much more complex than detectives first thought. The investigation of his life takes a leap forward when police search Gordon's work van.
What we find, to our surprise, is garbage bags. And in the garbage bags, there's personal mementos. Pictures of the children when they were young, all Mr. Gordon's.
Contrary to what the police first believed, David Gordon's business is failing badly. He's claiming over $300,000 in insurance, and he seems to know to the penny what every item in his house was worth. A forensic accountant discovers that the Gordons had been living far beyond their means. Is this an insurance scam? Would the hope of collecting insurance money be enough to make him destroy his own home and devastate an entire neighborhood? Have demons of greed possessed the soul of David Gordon? It's now June, 2 months since the explosion that leveled David Gordon's house and neighborhood. Every day, investigators Wilson and Keeley ask themselves the same question: who could possibly have done this, if not David Gordon himself? Every new piece of evidence seems to point right back to Gordon. The hate message is written on the inside of the garage door, an odd location for racist graffiti. The deliberately cut gas pipes in the basement. The family mementos safely stored in the van.
Mr. Gordon was brought into the station somewhere towards the end of June. Detective Wilson cautioned him at the time because he believed that he no longer was an innocent victim, that he was a suspect, and he's being investigated as the person who blew up his house.
Still, the evidence against Gordon is all circumstantial, and he was an hour and a half away when the blast happened. One hate letter sent to the police contains 3 keys, one of which fits the Gordon's garage door lock. We have your keys. We'll lock up. Signed, The Underground.
They introduced this group, The Underground, as the group responsible for this explosion. We, of course, from intelligence of the hate crime unit, started to pursue that and determine, is this a group that's known somewhere else? Is it a group in another part of the world that now has some members here in Toronto? Is it a group that is evolving? Is it a splinter group or a new group?
The letters contain an important clue: the handwriting of the criminal. Handwriting that looks like it's been intentionally disguised.
Usually in disguise, what the writer does is try to disguise the way the writing looks. That means a change in slant, a change in size, a change in the more obvious letter forms. You want to make them look as different as possible. But what doesn't change usually is the habitual things that you don't think about. How you cross your T's, where you start your O's. Those things that you do without thinking about are not easily disguised. When I saw this first, I knew immediately that it was disguised, and when you see something like this that's so heavily disguised, you do know that there's very little chance that you're going to identify it unless you have another disguised writing that's been somehow linked to the writer of the knowns.
Investigators have examples of Gordon's writing from the letters he wrote to the church. They also have the hate mail written in a disguised hand. Now they need to know for certain whether or not Gordon is writing the hate mail himself. Police plan a sting. They'll play on Gordon's desire to collect the house insurance, hoping to make him betray himself.
We went in and said that unless we get more hate mail, more evidence, we can't close this case right away. So we're in a bit of a dilemma, and I'm sorry, Mr. Gordon, but you're going to have to wait for a bit till we resolve this issue. And we sort of laid the seed, as it were. And he took it. The next day, we had surveillance on him for 24 hours a day.
Officers watch as Gordon notes the street address of the police station. They follow him to a residential mailbox.
He had a rolled up newspaper, and he had his hate mail letters in the rolled up newspaper, and he sort of looked around and made sure anybody wasn't looking. Opened the box door up and sort of jiggled the paper, let the envelopes fall in, and walked away to his truck.
Police seized the letters from the mailbox. Using only the second DNA warrant ever obtained in Canada, they take a blood sample from David Gordon. They'll compare it with the DNA lifted from the stamps on the envelopes from the mailbox. But police still don't have enough to make a solid case until they can link the two sets of letters.
You can see that the one on top is the known sample. You can see that the words Metropolitan, Toronto Police are very similar in letter form and construction and just a general style of writing. If you look in particular at the word Toronto at the top, you can see that the letter forms are all very similar. Again, farther down, the word Metropolitan. Below that, if you look at the M, if you look at the P, certainly they're very similar in letter form and in writing style. The agreement was dynamic. There was no fundamental differences. I have no doubt that the writer of those letters wrote the question letters as well.
The lab reports come back. Gordon's DNA matches the DNA found on the hate letter stamps. Police finally have the proof they need to arrest David Gordon. And they have a theory about what happened the day of the explosion. David Gordon was a gas fitter. It was part of his business as a furnace installer. He knew exactly where to cut the gas lines so the house would fill with an explosive concentration of natural gas. And he knew it would take long enough for him to be a safe distance away from the inevitable explosion. It was truly a miracle that no one was killed.
We'll never know the exact detonation. It could be something as simple as the freezer or the refrigerator coming on. If he hadn't wrote those letters, I don't think we've ever arrested him. We would have a strong suspicion to think, yes, that man did it. But was there enough evidence to take him before a court of law? I don't think so. It was the letters that was his undoing.
His own hate letters finally betrayed him to police. But it was Gordon's letters to the Worldwide Church of God that best revealed his twisted motivation.
I would say in Mr. Gordon's case, there was a dance going on between his religious background, his beliefs, and he's the one to lead the church in the end times. He's talking to God. He's getting visions. Satan and the demons are under his control. And in the end, you get the terrible results of him taking the law into his own hands, blowing his house up, probably for money, and then not admitting his crime to his fellow citizens.
David Gordon was sentenced to 11 years in prison for arson, endangering life, and hate crimes. The invisible hand of evil that reached into his community and his home was his own. He became the prophet of his own apocalypse when his religious aspirations became demonic possession. A pair of brutal murders, a tissue stained with blood, a mysterious list of names, and a rural eccentric apparently gone mad. Can the police find him before he kills again? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Police investigators invariably try to use logic to solve a crime, but occasionally they come across a case that, on the surface at least, makes no sense at all. In the spring of 1992, a young woman struggles to explain what has just happened to her. She tells police that when her aunt and uncle failed to attend a recent family gathering, she volunteered to go to their Toronto home. Once there, she made a horrible discovery. The cause of death for Derek and Julie Palmer is anything but natural. The homicide squad is called in. Doug Grady is the lead investigator.
One of the first things we did was try to establish the last hours, and in particular, in this case, days, because they had been missing for approximately 2 or 3 days.
Derek and Julie Palmer have been happily married for 25 years. According to their niece, they have no enemies. No one in their circle can understand why anyone would want to do the Palmers harm. Forensic identification officers search the Palmers' car for clues. They find a blood-stained tissue on the front seat. Police learn that Derek was an avid photographer. They find several cameras have gone missing from his darkroom. The Palmers' bodies are taken to the morgue. Forensic pathologist Noel McAuliffe conducts the examination.
The female had been beaten around the forehead and face. There were clear indications of bruising. Of specific interest were ligature marks, which were clearly delineated on both wrists and ankles. The injuries on the front of the body would lead me to the opinion that she was bound hand and foot, that these ligatures were joined, and that she was carried as one would carry a basket and bounced around lightly on the floor. It would be indicative of a sexual component to this particular crime. In contrast to the female victim, the male victim had a clear ligature mark on one wrist only. The remaining signs of violence on this individual are evidence of manual pressure on the neck, again with signs of asphyxia.
The Palmers have been brutally murdered. Why? And where could these murders have taken place? Police learn that the couple had a farm in the Caledon Hills, 1 hour northwest of Toronto. When Derek failed to return to their North Toronto home that spring evening, his wife apparently grew anxious. Family members and friends say she called around to ask if anyone had seen or heard from her husband. It was the last time any of them ever heard from Julie. But telephone records the police obtain indicate that Julie received a call from Caledon that evening. Investigators now turn their attention to the Palmers' Caledon farmhouse. Led by Jim Hutchison, Ontario Provincial Police investigators begin searching for clues.
We had the OPP ERT team out, and we scoured all the concessions, the ditches on either side, all around the area on the side roads.
In the Palmers' garbage, investigators find many strange things. Human feces carefully wrapped in newspaper, pornography, and several sheets of paper, full of lists of mysterious items. Inside the farmhouse, police find a newspaper that is missing the section in which the feces have been wrapped. Clearly, whoever left the garbage behind has been inside the Palmers' farmhouse. But what does it add up to? Who were the police looking for? For investigators on the Palmer case, the answer would ultimately lie here. Exhibit A, a handwritten list of names that make no more sense than the murders themselves.
There were a lot of lists of pieces of artillery, ships, airplanes, and they were being crossed off. So it looked like they made a list and then they crossed it off. And at the start, we didn't know what to make of it.
Grady turns to forensic handwriting analyst Greg Dawson for help.
It's just a list, a series of numbers and dates, and it's all kind of wartime thing. A lot of it was dated from 1938 to 1946, and then it would list the military hardware of the Allied and Axis forces, and dates and months, January to February, 10 months. And it says 20Z SO6C. I have no idea what any of this meant.
Disturbed by the brutal manner in which Julie Palmer was killed, investigators asked behavioral profiler Kate Lyons to develop a profile of the murderer.
So then you're starting to consider, is this someone who is sadistic towards their victims? The manner in which she would have been treated when she was tied, that would have been excruciatingly painful. So certainly there was indications very early on that this woman would have been in a great deal of pain prior to her death.
Inside the Palmer's farmhouse, investigators find a small blood stain. They send a sample to the lab for analysis. The blood matches that of Julie Palmer. Grady then learns that the OPP officers recall having found similar handwritten lists at other Caledon area break-ins. Over the past several months, a series of break-ins has taken place not just in the Caledon Hills, but in much of central Ontario's cottage country. The police have gone so far as to give the mysterious intruder a nickname. He is known as the House Hermit because he lives for a while in the houses he breaks into. In the past, the House Hermit has always run off when discovered. Is it possible that he has turned into a killer? Doug Grady and his investigative team have to find out. Whoever has been breaking into cottages in the Caledon Hills area has been living in those cottages for weeks and sometimes for months at a time. The House Hermit makes a practice of stealing valuable knickknacks and guns whenever he can find them.
In all these sites, there were artifacts that were brought together. Valuable coins, little trinkets that the owners of these places couldn't account for.
In the cottages where he was surprised in, there was quite a bit of stolen property, plus feces and the wraps and urine in bottles and the writings that were there common to all the locations. Where he was not surprised, the cottages were cleaned out and there was nothing left. There was as if he was never there.
As details of the Palmer murders reach the public, fear of the House Hermit grows, both in the Caledon area and beyond. A composite drawing of the suspect is released. Police receive hundreds of phone calls, but no leads. Grady knows he has one more card to play.
The one thing we knew we had that was our suspect's identity was the handwriting, the list. That was something we knew, and we were all convinced from the investigative side that this was the one way to identify the person.
Grady decides to have a copy of one of the lists published.
We got one phone call. That's all. One.
Sometimes one phone call is all it takes. An artist living in Barrie, Ontario, tells police that she recognizes the handwritten list. She believes that it belongs to a local antique store owner who was at one time her husband's business partner.
She identifies the writing as that of David Alexander Snow. She's known him for a period of time because her husband and David Snow were in business together, taking down timber frame houses and reconstructing them in other locations. She recognizes the writing because she had seen many, many different pieces of paper with that same writing, the same lines of military equipment.
The artist has no idea what the lists mean, but she is certain that David Snow wrote them. Because Snow is an antiques expert, police can now see why the robberies always seem to involve the theft of valuable objects. The Barrie artist says that while David Snow's life was never easy, things really started to go downhill for him in the fall of 1991. Snow's antiques and restoration business foundered. He wrote several bad checks. When fraud charges were laid against him in October, Snow simply vanished. Around the same time, the house hermit began to make his presence felt in the Caledon Hills. When police execute a search warrant at Snow's abandoned home, they find many other lists of military equipment. Forensic handwriting expert Greg Dawson is now called on to prove that the handwriting of the Palmer's murderer, the house hermit, and David Snow are in fact one and the same.
The O you see is written small, smaller than all the other letters. Now that in itself isn't unusual. Most of us, a lot of people write a smaller O than other ones. But you see how high the end comes up. The terminal stroke of the end comes up high. You see it's doing it over here and here. The shape of the E, okay? The same shape as this one. It's a three-stroke E. A significant number of cases that I do, I am unable to express any conclusion at all. Sometimes we can give a positive. This is definitely in a positive. It's a very strong identification. It's about as strong as I've probably ever had.
Armed with this knowledge, investigators now return to the Palmer's farmhouse. Here they find another clue, an address book. In it, David Snow's name and phone number are listed. From the Barrie artist, police learned that Snow coveted the Palmer's barn. He once had dreams of dismantling it for his business. 2 years ago, he even went so far as to meet with the Palmers to discuss the matter. But while Derek Palmer was happy to take a photograph of the meeting, in the end, he and his wife did not want to part with their barn. So the Palmers knew David Snow. Was it this knowledge that cost them their lives? Doug Grady can't be certain. All he knows is that he must find the man. But where has Snow gone?
We knew through telephone records from the farmhouse that there were contacts to the GO train stations, to the other train stations in the area, bus terminals. We knew that David Snow, who didn't drive, was trying to get out of the Toronto area. So we knew that he was on the move, but we didn't know where to, though.
It isn't long before a series of Vancouver area sexual assaults come to Grady's attention. That summer, there are 3 young female victims in just 3 weeks. The third attack is on video store clerk Natalie Bell. A co-worker tells police that Natalie has been kidnapped in broad daylight at gunpoint. Acting on a hunch, 2 local officers decide to check an area near Mount Seymour, where local car thieves often dump stolen vehicles. But the officers have no idea what lies ahead of them. At a makeshift camp, Natalie has just been forced to join a second kidnapped victim. Fiona Magnetta has spent 8 days stripped and bound. She has also been sexually assaulted. Hearing the officers approach, Natalie's assailant flees. The women's description of their kidnapper convinces police that they just missed catching the notorious David Snow. The search for David Snow goes into overdrive. In the next several hours, It becomes the largest manhunt in Vancouver area history, but somehow Snow continues to elude capture. Who will Snow's next victim be? Returning to Natalie's car, the officers make a discovery that leads straight back to the Palmer murder case and to Detective Doug Grady in Toronto.
There was photographic equipment in the back of the car, which we found receipts for in the house of the deceased in Ontario. So the photographic equipment matched up serial number for serial number.
Police also find handguns in the car, stolen during the Caledon break-ins. The guns are loaded, ready to be used. But Grady and his team soon realize that Snow's patterns have not remained the same in recent weeks. If anything, they have intensified. David Snow is out of control.
I think the most indication we have about Snow's interpretation or what his likes and dislikes in relation to the opposite sex were clearly demonstrated in his crimes in British Columbia. And that is very sexually sadistic, very degrading behavior, very torturous, painful, prolonged pain for his victims, especially during sexual activity. That tells me that this person is a sexual sadist, that they derive sexual satisfaction from the infliction and the response of victims to the pain that that person is inflicting. And that to me is speaks volumes as to what his sexual fantasies must be. I mean, he kept one of his victims for more than 8 days.
In the afternoon of July 12th, Eva Spielman is closing up the Evergreen restaurant in North Vancouver where she works. Responding to the burglar alarm Eva was able to trigger, 2 police officers arrive on the scene. Eva fights for all she is worth, but she is no match for the larger Snow. By the time they reach her, Eva is losing consciousness. She barely survives the attack. Finally, after 3 months on the run, David Snow is in custody. He makes no confession. He refuses to even talk to the police. But Doug Grady feels he can make the case against Snow without Snow's help. Grady now has his murder theory. When Derek Palmer arrived at his farmhouse that spring afternoon, Grady believes that Snow confronted him immediately. After beating and binding him, Snow then forced Derek to call his wife in Toronto. Julie was soon on her way to Caledon. Snow killed Julie at the farmhouse. Then loaded Julie's body into the trunk of her car and forced Derek to drive him to Toronto. Once inside the Palmers' North Toronto residence, Snow then killed Derek. To seal the case, Grady now tries to link Snow to one more piece of evidence.
The final piece of evidence, that was the best piece of evidence, was the bloodied tissue in the front seat of the deceased car in Toronto.
Police send a sample of Snow's blood to the lab. They get a match.
And that's what ultimately convicted him of the murder of the couple in Toronto. In my opinion, he killed the Callanan couple because he sexually assaulted, in his own way, the deceased female. And he killed the male strictly for domination and to eliminate a witness.
I don't know that we can ever understand the motivations of these types of criminals. Their sadistic nature, their cruelty, their degradation of women in particular. I don't know that we can understand that type of person, but certainly in order for a community to be safe, that person needs to be off the street and behind bars.
On August 21st, 1992, David Snow was convicted of robbery, kidnapping, and sexual assault in British Columbia. He was later sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Derek and Julie Palmer in Ontario. Declared a dangerous offender, he is currently incarcerated for an indefinite period of time.